Good morning everybody who are enjoying this radio class, and I welcome you all to my class. I appreciate all the concerned authority and related person for giving and providing us the opportunity of delivering radio class through AIR filter. Dear children, today I am going to teach you the lesson Footprints Without Feet of Class 10 Supplementary Reader. Footprints Without Feet, it is a version extracted from the book The Invisible Man, composed by H.G. Wells. So, before going through the lesson, I think it is better to know something about the writer. Children, H.G. Wells, his full name is Herbert George Wells. He was born on 21st September 1866 at Bromley, Kent, London. He was an English novelist, journalist, sociologist, and a historian, best known for his science fiction novels, The Time Machine and The War of the Worlds, and for his comic novels, Tonobangi and The History of Mr. Polly. He was the son of a domestic servant turned small shopkeepers. He grew up under the continual threat of poverty. At the age of 18, he won a scholarship to study biology. He graduated from London University in 1888. He was died on August 13, 1946. He is now best remembered for his science fiction novels, and he is often called the father of science fiction. He wrote many books and short stories. Among them, The Country of the Blind, The Red Room are his notable short stories, and The War of the Worlds, The Island of Dr. Moreau, The Time Machine, The Invisible Man, The Outline of History are some of his notable books and works. Now children, open your book, The Footprints Without Feet, at page number 26, and I ask you to take a pen and paper also to note down the importance and the meaning of difficult words wherever and whenever necessary. Okay children, before we are going through the lesson, I am telling you some tips of the story in short. Number 1, in this lesson, the writer wants to highlight the effect of misusing one's capability, discoveries, and the adventures and challenges faced for misusing the power. Second, the incident of this story is happened in the London city in the extreme cool of mid-winter. The story of this lesson is the story of a scientist, Mr. Griffin. Mr. Griffin was the scientist who discovered some rare drugs after many experiments to become an invisible man, or as transparent as solid glass. Though Mr. Griffin, a brilliant scientist, he was a lawless man. He was a man of quick temper. Due to his misuse of his discoveries and quick temper, he faced a lot of challenges and adventure in his life, and forced him to leave London City and to spend his life as a stranger to escape from the court in a village called Iping. When he was in the village Iping, many mysterious episodes occurred, so the people of Iping suspected him. At last, the story was concluded with the humorous when the police constable as well as the people attended in a bar tried to arrest the scientist, I mean Mr. Griffin. Ang sa ay Manipuri da hajarake para asida ay bana ay kona takngi bese pot amabu Lana Sinarabagi, Patara Mahay Amasung, Madugi Mahayana, Tiangaba Awaba, Kudung Sadaba Kaya Dubuni, Aduga, Parasina Jawaba, Wariasi, London Sahada Tokiba, Todok Amagi Warini, Adusu, Nintam Tavi, Ingamatamda. Hariba Wariasi, Mr. Griffin Hariba, scientist Amagi Warini, Mr. Griffin Ase, Mibu, Mangamba, the invisible man Kani Haibagi, experiments Kiator Matunda, Madi Zamatama Tokpahidakra Tokpangam Kiba, Masung Hidaksing Adu, saying Togudagi, Masama invisible man Wikiba, scientist money. Mr. Griffin, Afaba, his single scientist, Mo Izerbasu, Mahagase, Ayan Masakandaba, Sumaran Masakandaba, Masung, Tuna Sawanba, Makalgi, Mio Odami. Mahagna, Putok number, Taglaba Hidaksing Adu, Lana Sina Rubadagi, Muslim Haki, Patavanamdava, Emotion, Aduna, Maram Oraga, Mahaki Punsida, Mirror Oyaleki, Mahaki Punsida, Awaba, Kaya Mayoknaki. Awaba Sing Asi, Natona Damak Mahak, Pazaraba, London City, Butadotuna, I ping Hariba, Kungang Adula Chatuna, Sakanda Mirror Oyaleki. Mahanga I ping Harib Kunanga living without Angak Potodoka Tokirami, Tondosing Adudagi, I ping Harib Kungang Asigi, Myoshina Mabu, Singha Bahurami. Mamida Variasi Zamni Humaro among the Losili, Havidi, Mr. Griffin, Pavalapa, Police Constable, Amana, Pagit Awotamda, Mr. Griffin, Masada Jalamba Bendes, Singha Dulotopodegi, Tadmatamahak, Miamgi Niangdagi, Mankirami. Okay, so now you will get name of some people and two boys when we go through the lesson. So it's better for us to understand the characters of the said people. Abidi, akona parasi parapumatamda miyoi karapunagani, miyoi singasi. Akona parasi parimangda kana no habisi kangdopana pagada hinakali. First of all, we find two boys who were in a great surprise to see a few footprints with muddy on the steps of a storehouse without feet. Here, the two boys are none but the assistants of the storehouse of London. Next, you will find Mrs. Hall, who tried to make friendly with the scientist. She was none but the landlord of the inn where Mr. Griffin lived in, I think. Clergyman. Clergyman means a person who engaged or employed in a church who works as an accountant. A curious episode of stealing in his house was happened once in an early morning. And you'll find Mr. Jaffer. Mr. Jaffer was a police constable sent by a magistrate to arrest the invisible man, I mean Mr. Griffin, the scientist. Okay, so then, let me tell you the story in brief and in an easy language. You try to understand the story. If you know and understand the summary of the story, then you can write and give the answers of any question related to this lesson. So you are asked to pay full attention to the summary, because in the school, if you have any doubt, you may ask your doubt directly and we can interchange or share our ideas. But this facility of interacting between you and me is quite impossible, as the class is not done in the classroom. You have no chance to ask your doubt or any question, since there is no phone program as before. Okay, so then you follow me, the summary in brief of the lesson. In the very beginning of the story, we find two boys in a great surprise to see a few fresh and muddy footprints of a barefooted man descending the steps and going towards the street. In a storehouse of London City. The two boys amazingly saw the footprints. They did not see anybody, so the two boys were much surprised to guess whose footprints they are, and who is the man, and what the man is doing in a barefoot in the store. So they followed the footprints with great fascination, but the footprints were slowly became fainter and fainter and disappeared altogether. The two boys remember about a scientist who had just discovered how to make the human body invisible or transparent as glass. The scientist was none but Mr. Griffin. Mr. Griffin, who carried out experiments after experiments for his discoveries to make himself invisible. As a result of his experiment, he was succeeded to discover a rare drugs, and he himself swallowed the drugs, and as soon as he swallowed the drugs he discovered became an invisible man. His discoveries was very curious and mysterious one, but the scientist was a lawless, a quick-tempered person. Once his landlord disliked him and tried to eject him, Griffin became quite angry and set fire to the house where he himself stayed as a revenge of the landlord's attempt to eject him. And Mr. Griffin, in order to escape from the landlord without being seen, he had removed his clothes and run away from the house. Dear children, Mr. Griffin, the scientist, became invisible or turned into transparent only when he became naked. If he wears clothes, then he cannot become invisible. So very important things you noted. In this way, Mr. Griffin became homeless wanderer, without having clothes, money, and quite invisible. It was in the mid of winter. There was extreme cold in London during that time. So, in order to make himself warm, he went into a big London store where he can get warm clothes and food. Here, children, you noted that though Mr. Griffin could turn into invisible, he could feel hunger, he could feel cold, and any feeling as he feel. He enjoyed the pleasure of clothing and feeding himself without any expense. He broke open boxes and wrappers and fitted himself out with warm clothes, with shoes, an overcoat, and a white brim hat. And in the kitchen of the restaurant, he followed up the meat with sweets and wine, and then settled down to sleep on the pile of quilts. He tried to escape from the store with proper clothing early in the morning before arriving anyone in the store, but he could not do so. When he woke up, he saw the two boys approaching the store. At this, he felt much panic and started to remove his clothes and his wearings to become invisible and to escape from the two boys without being seen. So he, being taken off all the wearings, ran down through the steps and ran towards the street. As he removed all the wearings to escape from the two boys, he once more became naked and invisible in the chill of January air. Mr. Griffin then decided to enter into the stock of a theatrical company at Drury Lane in the hope of finding clothes as well as something that would hide the empty space above shoulders. I mean the neck, face and head. He soon found a suitable shop there at theatrical company. He somehow managed to enter in a shop and made his way upstairs. A little later, he came out wearing bandages on his forehead, dark glass, false nose, etc. To escape without being seen, he attacked the shopkeeper and robbed him of all the money he could find. So Mr. Griffin, with the money and clothes robbed from the shopkeeper, to escape from the crowd of London City, he took a train to the village of Iping, where he booked 2 rooms in an inn. The people of the village started talking about the arrival of a stranger in winter. Moreover, when Griffin arrived there, he covered his face and head with bandages. So, his appearance was very uncommon, and it was an unusual event to arrive a stranger in winter in Iping. However, Mrs. Hall, the owner of the inn, made every effort to be friendly with Mr. Griffin, but Griffin did not pay any attention to the effort of Mrs. Griffin, and he told Mrs. Griffin not to disturb to his work, and he wanted to live in solitude. Mr. Griffin paid the fare of his room in advance to Mrs. Hall. In this way, after a few days, the stolen money that Griffin had robbed from a shop of theatrical company did not last long. He again fell in adventure of shortage of money and food. However, he did not disclose the matter to Mrs. Hall. Instead, he pretended to receive a check without any delay. Mr. Griffin, in order to gather money, decided to rob a clergyman's house at Iping. One day, early in the morning, a curious episode occurred in the clergyman's house, that the clergyman and his wife awakened by noises in the study room. They heard the chink of money being taken from the decks. The clergyman, holding a poker, a fire stick, firmly in his hand, flung open the door and shouted to surrender. But the clergyman became much surprised to realize that the room was empty. There was no one inside the room. He and his wife searched throughout the room, but found no one. All the money kept in the decks had been missing. On that same day, another curious episode occurred in Mrs. Hall's house. Mr. and Mrs. Hall woke up very early on that morning, and when they woke up, they found the door of the room where Griffin lived was found open. They were very surprised to see the door open, which was not happen easily. So they peeped round the door, saw nobody, and decided to investigate the room. They found the clothes and bandages that Griffin always wore were lying about the room. Mr. Griffin was also not in the room. All of a sudden, Mrs. Hall heard a squeak. too close to her ear, and a moment later, the head of the scientist on the bedpost lifted up and dashed into her face. Then the chair sprang up and forced them two out of the room. And as soon as they went out of the room, the door locked after them. They saw no one to shut the door. So they thought that the room was haunted by spirits. And the stranger, Griffin, had been somehow caused there to enter into her furniture. This is the two curious episodes occurred on the same day at Iping after the arrival of Mr. Griffin. Thus, the news of burglary at the clergyman's house and the strange incident happened in Griffin's room became known to all the villagers. The villagers suspected the stranger of having hand both in the two curious episodes occurred in the early morning of the same day. Mrs. Hall's suspicion grew stronger when Mr. Griffin suddenly produced some ready cash to pay her. So, Mrs. Hall wanted to know about the mysterious incident happened in her house and how Mr. Griffin came out of an empty room and how he entered the locked room. Mrs. Hall searched him. Mr. Griffin, on the other hand, giving any reply to Mrs. Hall, became quite angry and wanted to show who he was and what he was. So, Mr. Griffin suddenly threw off bandages, whiskers, spectacles, and even nose, and thus he became a headless man. The people who were in the bar found themselves staring at a headless man. In the meantime, Mr. Jaffer, a police constable, arrived to arrest the stranger without a hat. So he tried to get hold of the headless man. He became more and more invisible as he threw off one garment after another. So as you see in the picture at page number 50, you see the picture. Finally, a sword flew into the air and the constable found himself struggling with someone he could not see at all. In this way, Mr. Griffin was again able to escape from the constable as well as from the people who attended in the bar. Thus, the scientist, Mr. Griffin, again became invisible man. Ang sa parasige solampawari Manipuri dam hanuksarake munatasiko. Wari si hek hagulakpada nipa masani khak jum amagi sirida lekhom totpa khungub zawdaba khungun khara taburami. Khungun sing adu amagi matungda ama tawduna lambiramda chatkibagi unitawi. Maikhoi anina khungun asi kanagi khungun no amasung mi zawduna khungun asi karamna taribno khalmadagami. Adubu Maikhoi ngakna khungun sing adu jinglingida tapna mangkhirami. Matam aduda Maikhoi anina scientist amagi wari ingsinglami. Griffin haiba scientist amana miyoi bagi haksangbu karamna uhandaba natraga mangba ngangbadage haina sayang kaya torami. Mamai thangda jamna tangna thangba hidak khara puthoklami. Mahakna hidak sing adu sayang toboina chosilubadagi mahak mangba ngamba haibadi invisible man haibadu oiki. Griffin haiba scientist asi angakpa pot puthokpa ngamba จามให้สิงบะ brilliant scientist โมอิจาระบสูมหากอายนบุคังดาบะจามนัสาวันบะมิสักโมเอลมีนองมามหากนะเลดีบะจุงกีมาปูนามหากปูจิมทาดกลาบะไฮรูบกิดมักตามหากมาสับมังนะเลดีบะจิมอดูไม่ทาดกลามีอดูกะจิมบูอดูกีมาคุตตะกีนานทกปังยำนะบะมหากนะเซลิจารีบะพิรอลปุนามักลงทกลามีอดูกะจิมอดูทาดกตัวเจนคิรามีมาตางสิเดคนในขังเดบเสมิสเตอร์กริฟินนะ invisible man โอเนวิดมักมหากนเซลิบะพิรอลสิงอดูลงทกปะไตฮาบดี when he becomes naked he is invisible มาตามดูทำทากีไม่ไว้วันน่ะลันดันดักกายนิงลามีมารำอดูนะมหากนามาสามักปูสหันนบะมาดีอรุมบะพิรอลมาดีจานมาปอดใจพังกระดาบมาพัมลันดันกีสโตร์เฮาส์มาดาจังดูนะสามาสุงอัฐมอาหาวจูนจิงบะทักตุนานุงไอนะมาสาดะจับซาบะพีเสตุนะหิงจาริกลามีนงอาลักปดะมหากนะขณะขังนั้นนะจัดกีหัวนาริงเอดาสโตร์เฮาส์อดูดะทับกสุบะจาวบะมีปามาสานิคักลาปะอุบดกีพิรอลปุนมักลงทุกลากาเจนคิรามีมหากนะเจนคิบกีคนนั้นสิงอดูนี้มาสิดา footprints without feet หายวสิสโตร์เฮาส์สิดกีเจนคิบมาตุงดามหากนะอมุกดรูเรแลนด์เลบะเทียเตอร์วอลกีเซ็นเตอร์อเมดาอมุกโนนนะจังคิรามีอดูกะมหากนะจานาบะพิรอลกายาเสลกะดูการอดูกีมาปูบุสุพูดนะภาษาลุปากายามุนนะลันดอนซิตี้ทาดกลกะไอพิงไฮบะคุงรูดามีรถไว้นะรุมอเมดาบาราลงเลขีมหากนะไอพิงดาลากปะมะตัมดามหากมาไม่มามิดล้วนนะเดนเดสนะจะชินมันนะมหากผู้ชิงนรมีอเมซุงนึงทำทากิมะตัมดาอสุนนะสักขังดาบะมันนะลากภาษีกายาทุกตะบะทุกดุไว้นะมียามนะจามนะงังนะดมีอสุนนะมาตัมครั้งนี้เลยบะมาตุงดางกริฟินนะมาสาระจาวกภาษีทุมปุนามักลอยขีบนะอมุกไอพิงคงกังกีคงกังโดเลยบะคลาซิเมนอเมกิจุมดาฮุรานมาสังเกตทางละมีอดูบุมหากตี invisible man ไว้บนะคลาซิเมนมาตีมานาวนะไม่คุยกีสตาดีดุงกีเดียกสตัทำมาเซลฮุรานขีบดูจามนังปะทงตุเอรมีมหากนักคลาซิเมนกีจุมดาฮุรานมาจังละบันมิดอดูกีอายุตามิสเซสฮอลกีจุมดาฮาบดีวิปนเลรีบะรูมอดูกีท้องหางลกตุนาเลรมาเทงนักีอดูกะอังกปะทงดอกกายาสุมิสเซสฮอลมาเตมนาวนะวิปินกีรูมดาจังละบัตัมดาพังนักีฮาบดีมิสเซสฮอลมาเตมนาวนุมิดอดูจามนังฮักกุลลามีไม่ควรฮักปะมาตัมดามิสเตอร์กริฟินเลรีบะรูมอดูกีท้องอดูหางลกปะเทงนาลามีไม่ควรนะมิสเตอร์กริฟินกีรูมดาฮุรานมาจังละบะคันดูนะคุมทารามีอามาซุงไม่ควรนะจียงบดารุมกีมนุงดากันอาสุเลยบุรันดีไม่ควรนะจังละมาตัมดากริฟินนะเสลัมบะพิรอลไม่ได้เจลัมบะเบนเดสมาหันอุปมัตตุปีปุณมาพมุงมาทักตาเลยบุทังนารามีอาสุนนะมาตีมันดาวไม่ควรอันนี้นะรุมดาจีนหุ่นเจลิงเอดาอีกครั้งข้างเอาดนะมิสเตอร์กริฟินนะอุปตุปีอดูมาต้มตะไปขัดละกะมิสเซสฮอลกีไมดาทารักปะอดูกะรุมดุดาเลยริบะเสียร์นะไม่ค่อยอันนี้ตำนะตานารักปะอดูกะหางดูนั่นเลยรัมบะท้องมาต้มตะลุนชินขีบะอาศิกมบะอังกปะทงดอกกายาเสียมียามขังนารักเลยอามาซุงกริฟินบุสิงนาบะฮอรักเลยมารำอดูนะกริฟินบุจิงสินนาบะ police constable อามาทารักเลยสายรักอาศิดามิสเซสฮอลนะกริฟินบุกริฟินมิสเซสฮอลdaกริฟินนะจุมบาราออยนาเซียลพิรักีมาศิดามิสเซสฮอลกิจิงนาบะอามุกเห็นกันละมีมารำอดูนะมิสเซสฮอลนะกริฟินนะทอกีบะ angakpa thungdok kayagi maramda hangatlami. Masida Griffin sounding bana mahak kanano taklagi haina makokta jetliba bandage langthoklami amasung khudakta mahak makok yaudaba mi onkre. Serak sida barda phamliba mi kayana Griffin gi mong mataw jengra lerami. Aduga Mr. Zephyr haiba constable aduna makok yaudaba mi adu phagi honarami. Barda phamduna Griffin bu jenglamba mi singsu jauna mahakpu phanaba honaringeda mahaki masak mudaba invisible man haibadu oiduna miyamnagi nanthokna chenkirami. Angsa hojik samlatpa parasigi wari samlatna likhabrina akhoi hojik textbook tamu jengsi textbook sigi page number 2060 right margin gi top ta piriba sentencing ase imtang parake aduga khoi khanglam hanasiko. Can a man become invisible? This is the story of a scientist who discovers how to make himself invisible. Does he use or misuse his discovery? Here, the writer asks a question, whether a man become invisible. If your answer is yes, then how? The writer tells us the story of a scientist who carried out experiments and succeeded to discover some rare drugs, and how the scientist himself become invisible. He does not use his discovery in a right and proper way. I mean, he misused his discovery. The scientist faced a lot of challenges and adventures due to misuse of his discovery. Masida scientist haibasi kana sunate ngasa ina explain tawla jawkiba Mr. Griffin haiba scientist aduni. Mahakna puthokhiba hidaksing mangba ngambagi hidak adu mahakna lana sinarami mahakna madubu asumba amadi aphaba lambida sinaramde. Nuga masida jawriba question ani khaksingu yangsi, how did the invisible man first become visible? Number 2, why was he wandering the street? Number 1, sida haribasi mataw karamna uba phangdaba mi adu ahan moina uba phangkirami. Masigi pakum ai samlona lirake nakhoisu nasana saraga inabu hanasi. Ahan mo hangi pakum, the invisible man was the scientist who discovered some rare drugs to turn himself an invisible man. The scientist once had a quarrel with his landlord, so the landlord disliked and wanted to eject him. In this effort of the landlord to eject him, he became quite angry, and to revenge, he set fire to the house where he lived and ran out of the house without being seen. After running out of the landlord's house, he had no any shelter, no clothes on his body. And due to extreme cold of winter, he wanted a safety place where he could warm himself and to find some food too. So he chose a storehouse in London. He somehow managed to enter the storehouse at the closing time. He spent the night with meat and sweets found in the kitchen of a restaurant. He put on warm clothes, had spectacles. He spent the night in a pile of quilt. In the early morning, when he tried to escape from the house, he saw 2 boys approaching the store. So he suddenly removed all his clothes and ran down the steps towards the street, leaving his footprints on the steps of the house. In this way, he was first seen by the 2 boys of the storehouse. Number 2, why was he wandering the street? Habadi mahak karigi damak lambi lamjau da kuchit chatun lady bano. Mahanga Sigi Pakum, he was wandering in the street amidst the extreme cool of mid-winter without any clothes on his body, because he was a lawless man. He, in order to revenge the landlord, he set fire the house, and in order to escape from the landlord, he put off all his clothes and became invisible. As he ran out of the landlord's house, he became homeless. He did not find any shelter, so he was wandering in the street. Mahagna lambi lamjauda kuchit chatun leibagi maramdi scientist habidi Mr. Griffin apawa heisingba brilliant scientist ama urabasu mahak jama sagonba masung asimaran masakhangdaba misak ama urami. Maramaduna mahagna leiriba jum adugi jumbu aduga nungai tabakra lerami. Jumbu aduna mahapu chakhinaba hairubagi damak Griffinna madugi laman kumbo oina mahak masamangna leiriba jum adubu mai thadok lami. Amasung jumbugi makuttagi nanthokpa ngamnaba mahakna setli chariba phirol punamak lokthoklaga mahak saklotpa sakuhandaba invisible man haibadu oikhi. Asumna jumbudugi jummai thadoktuna chenkhabanina mahaki anongba changjafam leitaba amasung jum leitaba namaram oraga mahak lambi lamjauda ingaba ingthamgi ulen marakta koise chatna lerami. Aduga you see the question given at page number 28. Page number 25 na piriba wahang singasi sujing sinsi. Why does Mrs. Hall find the scientist eccentric? Mrs. Hall na scientist adubu karigi eccentric karigi eccentric wana pangaribano. Eccentric habidi abnormal loiba habidi miyamga manadaba. Mrs. Hall found the scientist eccentric because he had an uncommon appearance. He responds rudely to Mrs. Hall when she met an attempt to make friendly behavior. He rudely responded that he had no desire to talk and he wanted solitude. Moreover, when Mrs. Hall searched him about the mysterious incident happened in his room, he became quite angry and said who he was and what he was. And then number 2, you see the question number 2. What curious episode occurs in this study? Kari natraga karamba angak pathongdok study da thokibagi habidi clergyman gizumda Griffina huran machongnaba thongdok adubuni sida khona curious episode haribasi. Rai asida mapungone khona curious damna angakpa episode ani khabu phangi. Episode amana Mr. Griffina clergyman gi junda huran machangnaba aduga nimit adumaki ayukta Mrs. Hall mate manawna Griffin gi room gi thongsing hanokna leramba amasung maikona Mr. Griffin gi room na changnaba matamda Mr. Griffin leramdaba adugi simathakta Mr. Griffin gi room da leriba chairs singna maikoni da tawapamong aduga Mr. Griffin na upa tupi na paikhatlaga makhona tharakamo asigumba angakpa thongdok ningkak thoki. Du patang sida curious episode occurs in the study habidi clergyman gizuna thokiba angakpa thongdok adumani. Wahang asigi pakumana the curious episode occurs in the study room of a clergyman at Iping. One day, early in the morning, the clergyman and his wife awakened by noises in the study room. They heard the chink of money being taken from the decks. The clergyman, holding a poker firmly in his hand, flung open the door and shouted to surrender. But the clergyman became much surprised to realize that the room was empty. There was no one inside the room. He and his wife searched throughout the room, but found no one. All the money kept in the desk had been missing. This is in short the curious episode occurs in the study. And the number 3, what other extraordinary things happened at the inn? The answer is, the landlord and his wife, Mr. and Mrs. Hall, surprised to see the door of the scientist's room open. They found to be a very good opportunity to investigate his room. After they got into his room, they found that the bedclothes were cool, showing that the scientist must have already woken up. All of a sudden, Mrs. Hall heard a step close to her ear. A moment later, the head on the bedpost lifted up and dashed itself into her face. Then the bedroom chair sprang into the air and charged straight at her legs. The extraordinary chair pushed them both out of the room and slammed and locked the door after them. This is the extraordinary things that happened in the room of Mr. Griffin. And now you see the textual question at page number, I think page number 31. Think about it. Number 1, Griffin was rather a lawless person. Comment. So as I mentioned you, that Griffin was a scientist, a brilliant scientist. Though he was a brilliant scientist, he was a man of lawless, and he was a man of furious and very aggressive. Griffin was rather lawless person. Comment means here. Yes, Griffin was rather a lawless person. By profession, he was a scientist. He must have been very capable in his profession. This had been proved by his invention. He invented a rare drugs that could make human body transparent, as glass and also invisible. But he was a revengeful person, and he burned the house of his landlord. He entered the London clothes store, stopped clothes, shoes and hat, and fed himself free in the kitchen of the restaurant. Such behavior is never expected of a scientist. He locked the shopkeeper at Drury Lane, stole his money. He stole the money from the clergyman's study. He misbehaved with Mrs. Hall, the wife of the landlord, and finally knocked down the policeman, Mr. Jeffers, who does not obey law or fails to behave properly and nicely, is surely a lawless person. Number 2, how would you assess Griffin as a scientist? Griffin bu scientist amoina akona karamna assess tawba jai. No doubt, Griffin must have been an expert scientist who could invent such things that could make him invisible. The aim of scientific man is to do good to his fellow man. In case of Griffin, it is seen that he did not bother much for the welfare of his fellow man. He applied his inventive genius simply for the gratification of his own interests. Apart from that, with the help of his magic, he went on stealing and robbing people. He did mischief in the London store, in the shop at the Drury Lane, stole the money from the clergyman. He behaved rudely with Mrs. Hall, and finally knocked the policeman. Mr. Jeffers, a scientist, is generally a man of humanity. But Griffin is quite opposite to such ideas and behavior expected of a man of science. He could have done some good to the society if we are liberal to use his knowledge for the welfare of mankind. Angangsa, SSLC exam the 20 lakanba, Muruebahang, Krasilu Ehereke. Angangsa, Matam Sila Silapagalonia, Miamdegi, Kanyana Bajatan. Thank you.